night. An empty street. The silence, usually so calming, suddenly feels oppressive. You're walking home, convinced nothing unusual will happen, but the footsteps. They're not yours. Every step you take is echoed by someone else. You quicken your pace and they follow. You don't dare look back, but something is already close. And when you finally feel safe behind a locked door, there's a knock. Someone or something is standing on the other side. Are you ready to find out how it ends? It wasn't supposed to be a scary night, just a regular walk home after staying late at the office. I've done it 100 times before, weaving through dimly lit streets where the orange glow of streetlights gave everything a dull haze. The city always felt smaller at night, quieter, safe even, or at least that's what I thought. Let me back up a bit. My name's Dan, and I'm just a regular guy. Early 30s, single, nothing particularly extraordinary about me. I work as an editor for a small publishing company, and my life is fine. Not thrilling, not depressing, just fine. I live alone in a modest apartment about 2 miles from the office, and since I don't own a car, walking is my default. It's cheaper than a cab, healthier than sitting on a bus, and honestly, the time helps me clear my head. That night started like any other. I had stayed late because of a looming deadline, the kind where every typo feels like a personal failure. By the time I shut down my computer, it was well past 10. I threw on my jacket, slung my bag over my shoulder, and stepped out into the crisp January air. The first stretch of the walk was uneventful. The streets were mostly empty except for the occasional car and the flicker of TVs through apartment windows. I had my earbuds in, listening to a podcast about unsolved mysteries. Ironic. I know, but halfway through, the host's voice began to feel intrusive. I paused it and let the silence set. That's when I noticed it. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just a faint sense of wrongness, like the way a room feels after someone's been in it without your knowledge. The hair on the back of my neck prickled, and I glanced over my shoulder. Nothing. Just the empty street and my shadow stretching long under the streetlights. I shook it off. Probably just my imagination. Or maybe the podcast had gotten to me more than I realized. Either way, I picked up my pace, telling myself I'd feel better once I was closer to home. About 10 minutes later, I turned onto the shortcut, a narrow alley that shaved a good 5 minutes off my walk. I've taken it countless times, even at night, and it's never been an issue. But as I stepped into the alley, the unease returned, stronger this time. It was quiet, too quiet. I know that sounds cliche, but I can't think of a better way to describe it. The usual hum of the city, the distant cars, the occasional shout, even the rustling of leaves was gone. It was as if the alley had been sealed off from the rest of the world. And then I heard it. Footsteps. They were faint, just barely audible over my own. At first, I thought they were echoes, bouncing off the brick walls. But then I stopped walking, and the footsteps didn't. My heart started pounding. I told myself it was nothing, maybe just someone else taking the shortcut. I even considered turning around to check, but something in me instinct maybe screamed not to. Instead, I started walking again, faster this time. The footsteps quickened to match mine. I don't know why, but I felt like I couldn't run. Like if I did, it would confirm something I wasn't ready to face. So I kept walking, my breath shallow, my ears straining to pick up every sound. I reached the end of the alley and turned onto the main road, relief washing over me as I saw the familiar neon glow of a 24-hour diner. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, I stood there, breathing hard, my eyes darting back toward the alley. It was empty. No one was there. I laughed, a shaky, nervous laugh, and told myself I was being ridiculous. Maybe I'd been hearing my own footsteps all along. Or maybe someone else had been behind me, but they'd gone a different way. Either way, I decided to stop at the diner for a coffee just to calm my nerves. The warmth of the diner was a welcome reprieve. I ordered a black coffee, sat at the counter, and let the normalcy of the place settle my nerves. There were a few other patrons, a trucker hunched over a plate of pancakes, an older couple sharing a slice of pie. Nothing unusual. I stayed there for about 20 minutes, long enough to finish my coffee and convince myself I was fine. By the time I stepped back outside, the unease had all but faded. The streets were quiet again, but not in the same eerie way as before. I felt safe. That feeling didn't last. I was about 2 blocks from my apartment when I heard it again. The footsteps. This time, there was no mistaking it. They were close, deliberate, and definitely not mine. I didn't dare look back. Instead, I sped up, my pulse hammering in my ears. The footsteps quickened, matching my pace perfectly. I turned the corner onto my street, my apartment building now in sight. Relief surged through me, but it was short-lived. The footsteps were louder now, almost frantic. I broke into a run. I don't remember much of the next few seconds, just the sound of my shoes pounding against the pavement, my breath coming in ragged gasps, and the overwhelming need to get inside. I fumbled with my keys at the building's entrance, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped them. Finally, I got the door open, slammed it shut behind me, and bolted up the stairs to my apartment. Once inside, I locked every lock, deadbolt, chain, everything. Then I leaned against the door, trying to catch my breath. Silence. For a moment, I thought it was over. Maybe whoever or whatever had been following me had given up. But then I heard it, a soft, deliberate knock on my door. My blood ran cold. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The knock came again, louder this time. I backed away, my eyes locked on the door. My phone was in my pocket, but I didn't dare reach for it, afraid the slightest movement might give me away. And then, as suddenly as it started, the knocking stopped. I stood there for what felt like hours, waiting, listening. Eventually, I mustered the courage to check the peephole. Nothing. The hallway was empty. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I called out of work and asked the building manager if the security cameras had caught anything. He told me the cameras had been on the fritz for weeks. Figures. It's been a few days now, and I haven't heard or seen anything unusual since. But I can't shake the feeling that it's not over, that whoever or whatever was following me is still out there waiting. And the worst part? I'm starting to think they weren't after me. They were just making sure I got home. Have you ever felt like someone was watching you? Not the casual glance of a passerby or the harmless curiosity of a neighbor, but something deeper, something sinister. I hadn't, not until last month. My name's Evan, and I live in a small one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city. It's nothing special, peeling wallpaper, an occasional leak in the bathroom ceiling, but it's home. At least it used to be. I'm 32, single, and I work as a freelance writer. My life is pretty uneventful. I spend most of my days hunched over my laptop, churning out articles about everything from tech gadgets to travel destinations. It's not glamorous, but it pays the bills. I've always liked the quiet, the solitude, but now I'd give anything to not feel so alone. It all started on a Tuesday. I remember because I had a deadline looming, and I was glued to my desk, typing furiously. Around midnight, I decided to take a break. My back was stiff. My eyes burned from staring at the screen, and I figured a walk to the kitchen would do me some good. As I stood up, I heard a faint noise, a creak, like the sound of weight shifting on old floorboards. At first, I thought it was coming from the apartment above mine. The walls here are thin, and I've gotten used to hearing my neighbors' conversations, their music, even their arguments. But this sound wasn't coming from above. It was coming from my closet. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The closet door was shut, as always, but the noise was unmistakable. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the door, my heart pounding in my chest. Finally, I convinced myself it was nothing, a draft, maybe, or the building settling. I forced a laugh, trying to shake off the unease, and went to the kitchen for a glass of water. The rest of the night passed without incident, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Over the next few days, little things started happening. I'd wake up to find the bathroom door open when I was sure I'd closed it. Objects seemed to move on their own. My phone charger on the floor instead of the nightstand. The remote on the couch instead of the coffee table. At first, I thought I was just being forgetful. I work long hours, often late into the night, and I figured I was simply misplacing things. But the unease lingered. Then came the tapping. It started one night as I was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone. A soft, rhythmic tap, 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 like someone gently knocking on a door. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but when it happened again, louder this time, I realized it was coming from inside the apartment. I sat up, every muscle in my body tensed. The sound was coming from the living room. Clutching my phone like a lifeline, I crept out of bed and peeked around the corner. The room was empty, the furniture bathed in the pale glow of the streetlight outside. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. No response. I checked the windows, the locks, even the closet. Nothing. The tapping stopped, and the silence that followed was almost worse. I told myself it was nothing, a branch against the window, maybe, or the pipes in the walls. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. A few nights later, I woke up to find my bedroom door ajar. I always sleep with it closed. Always. I sat up, my eyes scanning the room, my ears straining for any sound. That's when I saw a shadow, faint but unmistakable, moving across the hallway wall. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, but by the time I reached the hallway, the shadow was gone. The next day, I called the building manager and asked if anyone had access to my apartment. He assured me that only he and I had keys, and he hadn't been inside. "You sure you're not imagining things?" he asked, half joking. I laughed it off, but his words stuck with me. Was I imagining things? Was I losing my mind? For a while, things seemed to settle down. No more tapping, no more shadows, no more misplaced objects. I started to think maybe I'd been overreacting, that my stress and lack of sleep had been playing tricks on me. But then, last week, I found the note. It was on my kitchen counter when I came home from a late-night grocery run. A small piece of lined paper with 3 words scrawled in shaky handwriting. "I see you." I stared at it, my stomach dropping. I knew I hadn't written it. I lived alone. I searched the apartment, every inch of it, but found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no footprints, no clues, just the note, sitting there like a taunt. That night, I slept with the lights on, clutching a kitchen knife under my pillow. The next morning, I called the police. They took my statement, looked around, and told me there was no evidence of a break-in. "Probably just a prank," the officer said, though his tone didn't match his words. I wanted to believe him. I really did. But last night, something happened that I can't explain. Something that makes me wonder if I'll ever feel safe again. I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of breathing. It was soft, barely audible, but it was there, steady, deliberate, and close. I lay frozen in bed, too afraid to move. My eyes darted to the corner of the room, where the faint outline of the closet door stood in the darkness. It was open. I know I didn't leave it that way. The breathing grew louder, more labored, like whoever or whatever was in the room was struggling to contain themselves. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, aiming it at the closet. It was empty, but as I swung the light around the room, I caught a glimpse of something that still haunts me. A face, pale and gaunt, peering at me from the crack in the bedroom door. I screamed and bolted out of bed, but by the time I reached the door, it was shut tight. I haven't been back to the apartment since. I packed a bag and left that night, crashing at a friend's place. I don't know what's happening, and I don't know if I'll ever have answers. All I know is that something was in that apartment with me, watching, waiting, and I don't think it's done with me yet. You know that feeling you get when you walk into a room and just stop? That gut instinct that tells you something isn't right, even though nothing seems out of place? That was my entire night 2 weeks ago, and I still haven't figured out how to explain it. For context, my name's Lauren. I'm 27, live alone in a small rental house, and I'm about as ordinary as they come. I work as a graphic designer, love cheesy crime shows, and spend way too much money on takeout. My life is safe, predictable, boring even. But that night, all of that changed. It started when I got home from my friend Claire's place. She'd invited me over for dinner, and we ended up spending hours talking and watching old sitcoms. By the time I left, it was almost midnight. Claire only lives about a 15-minute drive away, so I wasn't worried about getting home late. I didn't feel unsafe. I never do. My neighborhood is quiet, filled with retirees and young families. When I pulled into my driveway, I noticed something odd right away. The porch light, which I always leave on, was off. That wouldn't have been a big deal, except I distinctly remember turning it on before I left. I shrugged it off, figuring the bulb had burned out, and unlocked the door. The house greeted me with its usual stillness, the kind of quiet you only get when you live alone. I kicked off my shoes, dropped my keys on the counter, and headed to the kitchen for a glass of water. That's when I noticed the back door was unlocked. My heart skipped. I'm meticulous about locking my doors, especially at night. I could count on one hand the number of times I'd forgotten, but maybe I had been in a rush when I left. It wouldn't have been the first time my memory played tricks on me. Still, I couldn't shake the unease crawling up my spine. I double-checked the lock, yanked on the door to make sure it was secure, and told myself to stop being paranoid. But as I walked back to the living room, I felt it again, that wrongness. Like the air was heavier somehow, pressing down on my chest. I scanned the room, but everything looked normal. My couch, my coffee table, the stack of unopened mail. Nothing was out of place. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. To calm myself down, I did a quick sweep of the house. I checked every room, every closet, even under the bed. Nothing. No signs of forced entry. No indication that anyone had been there. By the time I finished, I felt a little silly. I told myself I was just overtired, that my mind was playing tricks on me because of the late hour. I settled onto the couch, turned on the TV, and let the familiar hum of a sitcom fill the silence. For a while, it worked. The laughter track and the brightly lit scenes lulled me into a sense of normalcy. But then I heard it. A soft, deliberate creak from upstairs. At first, I thought it was the house settling. It's an old place, after all, and it makes weird noises sometimes. But then it came again, closer this time, like someone was moving slowly, deliberately. I muted the TV, my pulse quickening. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. Silence. I stood, every nerve in my body on edge, grabbing my phone. I crept toward the staircase, peering up into the shadowy second floor. Is someone there? No response. I told myself it was nothing, that I was being ridiculous, but my instincts wouldn't let it go. Against my better judgment, I climbed the stairs, each step creaking beneath my weight. When I reached the top, I stood there for a moment, listening. The hallway stretched out in front of me, the doors to the bedrooms and bathroom all slightly ajar. I checked each room, one by one. My bedroom was empty, so was the bathroom, the guest room. The hallway closet, nothing. And yet, the feeling of being watched was so strong it made my skin crawl. I went back downstairs, locking the door to the basement as I passed it, just in case. My rational brain told me I was overreacting, but a deeper part of me, the part that had felt that wrongness the moment I stepped inside, wasn't so sure. I decided to sleep on the couch that night, thinking I'd feel safer in the living room. I turned the TV back on, left the lights on, and wrapped myself in a blanket, trying to ignore the gnawing unease in my chest. I must have dozed off at some point because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by a loud crash. It sounded like it came from the kitchen, heart pounding. I grabbed the closest thing to a weapon, a heavy book, and crept toward the sound. The kitchen was empty, but one of the cabinet doors was wide open, a glass lying shattered on the floor. I stared at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Did I leave the cabinet open? Did the glass fall on its own? And then I saw it. Faint, barely visible in the frost of the window above the sink, was a handprint, not mine. The world seemed to tilt, my vision tunneling as I backed away, my chest tight with fear. I didn't know what to do. Should I call the police? What would I even tell them? I decided to grab my keys and leave, at least until I could figure out what was going on. But as I turned toward the door, I froze. The chain lock was latched. I hadn't locked it. I'd been standing in the kitchen, right next to the door. I would have noticed if someone had. Every instinct screamed at me to run. But where? I was trapped, alone, and whoever or whatever was in the house was playing games with me. The rest of the night passed in a haze of terror. I sat in the corner of the living room, clutching the book like a lifeline, my eyes darting to every shadow, every flicker of movement. At some point, I must have fallen asleep, because I woke to sunlight streaming through the windows. The house was silent, and nothing seemed out of place, aside from the broken glass in the open cabinet. But the handprint on the window was still there. I left that day and haven't been back since. I'm staying with Claire while I figure out my next steps. I've told her bits and pieces of what happened, but not everything. Because the truth is, I don't know how to explain it. I don't know if it was a person or something worse. All I know is that I'll never forget that feeling, the heaviness in the air, the sound of those creaking footsteps, and the handprint that didn't belong. I've always thought of home as a safe place, a sanctuary. Now, it feels like the scariest place of all. Do you know that feeling when something doesn't sit right? like when you walk into a room and sense that someone's been there, even though no one should been. That feeling has been my constant companion for the past month. I didn't want to believe it at first, thought I was being paranoid, but now I'm sure something is wrong in my apartment. My name's Scene. I'm 27, recently single, and trying to navigate life in a big city where everything is overpriced, including my tiny one-bedroom apartment. I work in it, mostly remote, which means I spend a lot of time at home. It's not much a living room that doubles as a dining area, a cramped bedroom, and a kitchen just big enough to turn around in. But it's all mine. At least, that's what I thought. It all started the night my girlfriend, well, ex-girlfriend, packed her things and walked out. We'd been fighting a lot, and I wasn't exactly the easiest person to live with. After she left, the silence in the apartment felt oppressive. I told myself I needed to adjust, to embrace being alone for the first time in years. The first night was uneventful, though I kept the TV on for company. But the second night, as I was brushing my teeth, I noticed something odd. My toothbrush was wet. I always dry it off after using it, a habit I picked up years ago. At first, I thought I was mistaken, but the bristles were damp, and the faint scent of mint lingered in the air. I stared at it, confused. Was I losing track of my routine? I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe I'd forgotten, distracted by the breakup. The days went on, and more small things began to pile up. My laptop charger wasn't where I left it. The dish rack had an extra plate I didn't remember using. The blanket on the couch was folded differently than I would have done it. It was subtle at first, so subtle I thought I was imagining things. Then one night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was coming from the apartment above me. The walls in this building are paper thin, and I've heard everything from loud arguments to kids running around. But as I lay there, groggy and disoriented, I realized the sound wasn't coming from above. It was in my apartment. The footsteps were soft, almost tentative, like someone trying not to be heard. They moved slowly from the living room toward my bedroom. I froze, my heart pounding so loudly I thought it might drown out the sound. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, holding my breath as I turned on the flashlight. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the door to my room, which was slightly ajar. I stared at the crack, my mind racing. Should I call out? Get up? Stay still? But before I could do anything, the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, clutching my phone and staring at the door, waiting for anything to happen. But nothing did. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I must have fallen asleep. The next morning, I convinced myself it was a dream. It had to be. I was stressed, sleep-deprived, and dealing with a recent breakup. My mind was playing tricks on me. At least, that's what I told myself. A week later, I came home from running errands to find my front door unlocked. I hesitated, standing in the hallway, my pulse quickening. I was sure I'd locked it before leaving. I always double-check, slowly. I pushed the door open, stepping inside. Nothing looked out of place at first. The living room was as I'd left it, the kitchen counters clear. But as I moved toward the bedroom, I felt a chill run down my spine. The closet door was open. I never leave it open. I approached cautiously, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. The inside was as it should be, clothes hanging neatly, a few boxes on the floor, but there was one thing I couldn't explain. A shirt I hadn't seen in years was draped over the back of a chair in the corner. It was mine, but I'd thought I'd lost it during a move. Seeing it there, like it had always belonged, made my stomach turn. I decided to install a camera. It felt ridiculous, like I was overreacting, but I needed to know if someone was messing with me. The first night, the footage showed nothing. The second night, the same. By the third night, I started to feel foolish, like I was wasting my time. But on the fourth night, I saw it. Around 2 a.m., the camera caught a figure emerging from the closet. They moved slowly, cautiously, pausing to listen before stepping into the living room. They were thin, with long, unkempt hair, and they wore what looked like my clothes. I watched in horror as the figure moved around the apartment, picking up items, inspecting them, then putting them back. They opened the fridge, drank directly from a milk carton, then disappeared back into the closet. My blood ran cold. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't even stay in the apartment. I packed a bag and went to a friend's place, showing them the footage. "You need to call the cops," my friend said, their face pale. I did. The police came, searched the apartment, and found no one. But they found evidence scratches on the inside of the closet wall, a loose panel that led to a crawl space. It turned out someone had been living in my apartment. They must have sneaked in months ago during a time when I was away for a weekend. The crawl space connected to an old maintenance shaft that hadn't been sealed properly. I moved out the next day. I still can't wrap my head around it. The thought of someone being in my space, watching me moving around while I slept, it's something I'll never forget. Sometimes, when I'm alone in my new place, I think I hear those soft, tentative footsteps, and I wonder if I'm really alone.